Okay. I'm waiting for my slides to come up. There they are. For those of you who don't know me, I was the founding editor of a trade publication called Space Business News, which I'll call SBN, and I served as editor, reporter, proofreader, marketer, and everything else for the publication's first 2 years, from July 1983 to July 1985. And so I'm just going to review what the perennial stories were, and many of these issues have been mentioned by others during this conference. So in 1983, I was reporting on alternative energy projects for a small DC publishing company. And the associate publisher, David Gump, who later entered the so-called, what I call so-called commercial space industry, and was a co-founder of the now defunct asteroid mining enterprise, not space industries, deep space industries. He was interested in Reagan's promotion of the idea of commercial development of space. So he convinced the publisher that they could make money with a new publication devoted to the subject. And I had a month from the publication of my last energy issue to my first issue of SBN. Starting out, and you may find this hard to believe, but starting out, I did not know what NASA stood for. I did not watch the Apollo 11 landing on TV. I was in a bar when it occurred, and there was no TV. And I was not a space weenie, but I learned fast, and it took me about 3 months to develop a critical eye. So I want to mention some people at NASA and industry and elsewhere who were very helpful to me as I was starting out. General James Abramson and Ike Gillum at NASA, and Courtney Stadd and Charlie Chafer in the then commercial launch business, Marty Kress and Pete Perkins with Senate Commerce, Jenna Dorn at DOT, Del Smith with contracts and insurance, and the three founders of Orbital Systems, which later became Orbital Sciences, Dave Thompson, Scott Webster, and Bruce Ferguson. And I remember a few who were not helpful, including Jim Beggs as administrator of NASA, Bud Evans, the NASA Public Affairs Office, and Gil Rye with the Senior Interagency Group on Space. Very frustrating. Some of my best sources were investment bankers because they knew how to look at a business plan and tell if it was viable. Next slide. And starting out as to the topic of this symposium, what is commercial space? In my opinion, if it's a for-profit business, it's commercial. And as several other speakers have mentioned, private enterprise has been a part of space exploration and development from the beginning. Contract terms may have changed, but as far as I'm concerned, if you're making a profit, you're commercial. And remember what Milton Friedman said. Pete Warden and I have disagreed about many things over the years, but remember what Milton Friedman said in 1970, the social responsibility of business is to increase profits. So slide one, these were the big stories that they were perpetual. Almost every week I had a new update to talk about these things. And as far as I know, nothing really came of METSAT commercialization, but I'll get into some detail about other things. And of course, our next speaker, Brian, is going to talk about the whole Landsat mess, and the whole Landsat EOSat thing was one of those perpetual stories that just got more and more complicated. Next slide. Okay, this is what was on page one of my first issue. The Orbital Sciences guys were very helpful in filling me in on what they were working on. And we see the beginnings of this struggle for who's in charge of what in the commercial space sector. And of course, NASA was soliciting proposals to take over the Delta and Atlas, and we know where that stands today. It's United Launch Alliance. We had a number of industry proposals to build commercial space platforms for leasing to NASA and others. As far as I know, none of those proposals came to pass. John Logson might know more about that than I do. And also formation of a Chamber of Commerce task force on space commercialization. Next slide. Okay, 1984, 1985. NASA is contracting with consulting firms to drum up space station customers. And of course, the space station wasn't completed until, depending on who you ask, 1998 or 2011. Others have mentioned Congressman Bob Walker, and this is a quote from a story by Tim Fernholz in Quartz. I could not myself, but Tim found the origin of this $1 trillion space economy based on the space station by the turn of the century. Of course, that didn't happen. I believe Bob Walker's source was the Center for Space Policy, headed by David Lippy. David Gump was constantly pressing me to put David Lippy's stuff on the front page, and David Lippy would never tell me how he did his studies. He would just tell me about these results and give me all these numbers. Well, where did they come from? So Gump and I struggled about that. And of course, financing, as others have mentioned, you need lots of money. So that was a perpetual issue. Next slide. Commercial launch vehicles then. Have you seen some names and pictures in other presentations? I'm not sure that, I think all of these did not come to pass. And again, since John has written a whole book about this era, he may know better, but it was very interesting. There was a lot of interest, but it didn't come to pass. I don't think any of these initiatives accomplished what they wanted to. Space Shuttle of America Corporation wanted to privately finance a fifth orbiter and then lease a fourth orbiter. I never really understood that, but that was then. Next slide. And you all probably know in greater detail than I do who's in business. And I want to point out that SpaceX, and I appreciate that Matthew Hirsch mentioned yesterday that, augmentation rather than invention is the way to go with technology. And of course, SpaceX didn't invent the rocket. They have a new and improved rocket, and SpaceX has built itself up to be the sixth largest NASA contractor and number 52 on the list of top 100 U.S. government contractors. So this is the way you build a business: government in the beginning, subsidies, and then government contracts. Blue Origin, Orbital, Rocket Lab. I'm sure there are companies that I've missed that are in the launch business. And of course, we still have Ariane Space, and we have China, India, and Japan claiming that they're looking for commercial customers. And this is an error at the bottom. That should be ULA, not USA, United Launch Alliance. Next slide. Here are ideas for low Earth orbit platforms. And again, I'm pretty sure none of them came to pass. A couple of these outfits, I think, were developing hardware to send experiments on the shuttle. And I'm not sure what came of Microgravity Research Associates or Instrumentation Technology Associates. One of the problems with the shuttle was waiting in line, because sometimes there was jockeying to put more important customers at the front of the line, like McDonnell Douglas, and then PIs with who didn't have so much clout just had to wait in line. So that was a problem. And of course, shuttle flights never reached the frequency that many in the community had predicted in the beginning. Now we have nanoracks, very successful as far as I can tell. I cannot assess the success of marketing the ISS for commercial business. Next slide. Okay, materials processing in space. I know there's been a little bit of discussion in the chat and also in some previous talks about the interest in materials processing in space. And again, since post-July 1985, I went on to other things, and so I've only been following commercial space out of the corner of my eye since then, so to speak. I have no idea what came of these efforts. And in terms of pharmaceutical manufacturing in space, I have no idea. It seems to me that even with the ISS established as a national lab and open for business with the private sector, that it's still very, very expensive to do any kind of work in space. And again, others may know more about what came of these efforts, but I remember these were stories in the news in those 2 years. Next slide. Commercial remote sensing, and again, I'm not going to dwell on this because our next speaker is going to get into this. You can see that it's a very successful business. You can see Forecast International's predictions, and we do have a number of private companies who've built and launched their own satellite systems. Space America and EOSat. Again, next speaker is probably going to address EOSat. I found it a nightmare, and I could never get a straight answer out of Chuck Williams, who was the head of EOSat at the time. RTNDA only mentioned because Mark Brender, who was president of the Radio and Television News Directors Association at the time, was really talking up the need for commercially operated remote or commercial access to remote sensing because the news industry was starting to use remote sensing data from Landsat. Next slide. Commercial GPS. Some of you, perhaps all of you, are familiar with GeoStar, which wanted to build and operate its own commercial GPS system. GeoStar filed for bankruptcy in 1991. As far as I can tell, the government-built GPS system is operated by U.S. Space Force, and private companies can use the service. And of course, there are other countries who have launched their own GPS systems. So I would call commercialization of GPS service a success, even though in the U.S., the system is government-owned and operated. Next slide. Space tourism, my favorite subject. Here are a number, as far as I know, failures. Society Expedition, Space Travel Company, Armadillo Aerospace, X-Corp Aerospace, Space Expedition Corp, EADS, Astrium. Successes have been Space Adventures. And I list MirCorp as success, but I actually emailed Matt Hirsch and I said I would mention that he called it a failure because even though MirCorp was able to find customers to pay their way to the space station with MirCorp, we have no idea if MirCorp ever made any money, and of course it doesn't exist anymore. So I guess I could put that in the gray area. And in the works, we'll see what comes of these efforts. At space tourism. We'll just see. Next slide. Just a few, I don't know, amusing or appalling. Some things I reported in the publication. Air Force Captain James Sloan said construction of a ballistic missile defense system would promote the development of space-based industries. I didn't quite understand that. And all of us reporters, we love Hans Mark because you never knew when he would pop off. And so after he had left NASA, where he had given a lot of lip service to commercial development of space, he deemed all the talk about commercialization nonsense. And then funny little private sector enterprises trying to fly things on the space shuttle. And again, I don't know if Coke and Pepsi could fly their stuff on the shuttle after all, but that was the plan. Next slide. So this is just a personal anecdote. From 1999 to 2002, I was Director of Communications for SpaceHab, which called, I think we called ourselves, I should remember this because I had to write the boilerplate, the world's only provider of commercial space habitats. They were in the red, they were publicly traded, they were in the red the whole time I was with them. We received several NASDAQ delisting warnings in that time period because the stock price fell below $1. 1999, SpaceHab created a new subsidiary, Space Media, hired two VPs to build it. A year later, the two VPs disappear overnight after spending $1 million of company money with nothing to show for it. And the idea was to build a habitat, a space habitat that would be dedicated to television and movie production. Didn't happen, obviously. I was required as a director, directors and higher up in the hierarchy were required to invest a minimum of 5% of their salary on employee stock purchase. I was pressed to invest 10%, but I resisted. My total investment was approximately $40,000. And just last December, I finally cashed in my stock because all that was left of SpaceHab was Astrotech, and Lockheed Martin bought it years ago. Astrotech is a payload processing company. So my $40,000 investment was worth $250. So be careful if you want to play around investing in commercial space. Somebody should write a book about SpaceHab. That was a real trip. Next slide. What's changed since 1983? Well, in the 1980s, NASA was using joint endeavor agreements with private companies. They were offering relatively low-cost payload options. And of course, hitchhiker payloads and getaway specials were launched on the shuttle. In the 2000s to the present, NASA has really jacked up the use of Space Act agreements. Some are no exchange of funds, some there is some exchange of funds, and I don't think NASA is either able or willing to accurately calculate the value of the services and expertise and data that NASA provides to private companies under Space Act agreements. Then we have cases. We have nanoracks. I already mentioned this. We have CubeSats, microsats, nanosats, picosats, femtosats, lots of much more affordable ways to do work in space, whether it's research or something else. There have been changes in the venture capital market, and I don't follow the venture capital market any more closely than reading the newspapers, but there have definitely been changes in the venture capital market. There's been, of course, further consolidation of ownership in the aerospace industry, and we have GOP dominance in Congress since the Reagan years, particularly starting with Newt Gingrich's rise to power. And John has mentioned Bob Walker and Newt Gingrich before. Obama gave a big boost to commercialization, probably the biggest boost since Reagan. And in 1983, we had 14 billionaires in the United States. And in 2021, we have 614 billionaires in our nation. And with rising economic inequality, we have more people who can spend 50 million plus on a space ride. Next slide. If you have any questions or want to argue with me, feel free to do so. I appreciate it, but I'll stop there.